Well, since you were kind enough to raise everyone's expectations, let me begin by dashing them. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes, neither facts nor the truth should get in the way of a good story. And a good story indeed is one that is told about the late French President Charles de Gaulle, who, upon his stepping down from that high office, was invited to visit his colleague Harold Macmillan, who was then Prime Minister of England. And the Macmillans hosted the de Gaulles at a private supper at 10 Downing Street. And Mrs. Macmillan, it is said, turned to Madame de Gaulle and said, "Tell me, my dear, now that the general has stepped down, what are you looking forward to most?" And Madame de Gaulle said, "A penis." And there was a moment of awkwardness, and then the general leaned in solicitously to his wife and said, "I think, my dear, that the English pronounce it happiness." I give you that story by, well, now that we have established the level of your interest, I will do my best not to disappoint you. Herb Bloch and I were, it turned out, colleagues at the Washington Post, fellow cartoonists. This came about because Meg Greenfield, the late, great Meg, in her capacity as den mother and editor of the op-ed page, was also responsible for the care and feeding of editorial cartoonists. And in this capacity, she threw an annual dinner. Meg and her good friend Kay Graham threw this annual cartoonists dinner, and one year in the early 90s, I think it was, Meg called me and invited me to be that year's surprise guest. It was expected of surprise guests at this event that they do something amusing. When called upon to do anything amusing, I sing. Usually lyrics that I've written to mark some bizarre occasion, as was the case, for example, back in 1972, when Richard Nixon visited China. Some of you will recall that he was taken out to the Great Wall. And as he was standing there on the Great Wall, the pool of reporters, there were about 5 reporters and camera people there, my ABC colleague Tom Jarrell, who was then White House correspondent, walked up to the president and thrust a microphone in his face and said, "Mr. President, what do you think of the Great Wall?" And Richard Nixon, who was a very smart man, but not great at small talk, said, "Well, one can only say, upon looking at this wall, that this is truly a great wall." Swear to God. Every once in a while, when my wife and I get depressed, we shove the VCR in the machine and play it again. And never fails to lift our spirits. Anyway, on the flight from Beijing to Shanghai, I sort of speculated on what the White House staff could have done under the circumstances, and not that I'm suggesting that the President of the United States would ever have resorted to song on such an august occasion, but I wrote a song about the Great Wall, and it goes something like this. In fact, it goes exactly like this. It's a grand old wall, it's a long-standing wall, wins the prize for its size and its age. It gave just rewards to the Mongol hordes, drove the kulaks away in a rage. From Beijing to the seas, it has saved the Chinese till the days of the Kuomintang. From Ming to Han, and on and on. With the Great Wall, you can't go wrong. Be careful, you're just encouraging me here, and all of this will come together. Madame de Gaulle's little inadvertent faux pas. Anyway, when in 1993 Meg Greenfield invited me to my first editorial cartoonist dinner, attended, I should add, by the estimable Herbert Bloch, I rummaged through the news events of the day and stumbled across John Wayne Bobbitt's penis. John Wayne and his member were, you may recall, separated by Mrs. Bobbitt. Lorena Bobbitt had been badly and repeatedly abused by her husband and one day retaliated by cutting off his Johnson. It was in all the papers, and as you can imagine, cable television couldn't get enough of it. It was actually a serious story of wife abuse, but when John Wayne had his member reattached and went on to achieve dubious distinction as a porn star, any hope of the story becoming anything more than a punchline was gone. Not to mention the fact that it seemed like a totally suitable subject for an editorial cartoonist's dinner. So to square the circle, I wrote this little song for the occasion. Now, I'm going to need some help here. What I need is you to go boom, 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 ya-de-da-de, boom, boom. Can you handle that? Boom, ya-de-da-de, boom, boom, boom. Yeah, that's very good. Keep going. Boom, boom. Lorena, dear, come over here and don't play around with that cleaver. It isn't nice to chop, slice, or dice just to make him a believer. Yeah-de-da-de-dum. Well, anyway. Tasteless, no, please, don't lower your standards just this soon. Tasteless and trashy as the song may have been, it gained me an immediate and enthusiastic welcome into the fraternity of editorial cartoonists. And for years thereafter, until Meg and Kay passed on, I was invited to the annual dinner carrying the title of honorary editorial cartoonist. I have already once alluded to Richard Nixon. I was not only with him in China during his 1972 visit, I also covered most of his presidential campaign in 1968 and interviewed him several times when I was the anchor of Nightline. That, in and of itself, creates yet another bond with Herblock, many of whose most memorable cartoons probed deeply into the Nixonian psyche. He, Nixon that is, was a man, as I've already suggested, uncomfortable with small talk. There is that brilliant scene in Frost, Nixon, just before one of their interviews, when Nixon, in an excruciating moment of imagined male bonding, asks Frost, "Did you do any good fornicating last night?" Also true. When Leonid Brezhnev died, we did an extended nightline in which I interviewed several former secretaries of state and several former presidents, among them President Nixon. I didn't get home that night until nearly 2, and when the phone rang the next morning, shortly before 8, my wife, who was an attorney, was already at work, and the kids were at school. So I picked up the phone, a little bit groggy, only to hear this unmistakable voice. "Hello, Ted. President Nixon here." And I said, "Yes, Mr. President, what can I do for you?" And the first words out of his mouth, I swear to God, "I didn't realize you got up this early." Her blog often succeeded at capturing this slightly manic quality of Nixon far better than we reporters did. It's a talent that resonates in the success these days of Jon Stewart. What John does, it seems to me, bears a striking similarity to the work of a great editorial cartoonist. But just as putting her block on an otherwise empty front page of the Washington Post would have done an inadequate job of covering the news, so too, substituting Jon Stewart's Daily Show for a more traditional television news program is simply not enough. I often make the point to young audiences that a great satirist like John is analogous to a great editorial cartoonist. Each adds immeasurably to the process of straight reporting, but neither is a substitute. The news crisis of our time, if I may get serious for a few moments before I take your questions, is that straight reporting has increasingly fallen victim to technology and business considerations. During the late 60s and early 70s, I spent 3.5 years in Southeast Asia as a war correspondent. We used film in those days, as my old friend and colleague Sam Donaldson, who was also there at that time, well remembers. Film. And the film, because satellite technology was new and very expensive, had to be shipped back from the battlefield to Saigon, on to Tokyo, where they were transshipped to Los Angeles and finally to New York. 2 to 3 days, usually, which meant that our scripts in those days needed to lean more heavily on perspective than timeliness. You didn't want to say something that might already be dated 72 hours later. Contrast that with the emphasis of today's news coverage. The cable television networks in particular tend to focus on what is most recent rather than what is most important. Immediacy has displaced relevance. And if that is true of cable and satellite TV, it is even more applicable to the internet and the ethos of Twittering, in which no banal thought goes unreported. While the impact on print may be less vivid, every newspaper reporter these days has to be conscious of the web and its 24-hour news cycle, along with the possibility that next month she may be working for a paperless newspaper. Speed is often the enemy of accuracy, and the news business today is obsessed by speed.